Welcome to UNC Asheville's Brown Bag today. My name's Ashley McGee Whittle. I'm the Assistant Archivist and Special Collections Assistant at UNC Asheville's Ramsey Library Special Collections. And it is my pleasure to introduce two of my colleagues who will be talking about raising archival awareness in a regional studies organization, the Appalachian Studies Case. So first we have Jean Hyde, who has an MA in Appalachian Studies from Appalachian State and an MS in Information Sciences from the University of Tennessee. At UTK, he wrote his thesis on the history of Appalachian special collections, and that has informed his career ever since, in which he wishes me to tell you will hear about today. He has been an Appalachian archivist since 2008 and developed the Appalachian Archives program at Radford University, prior to moving to UNC Asheville in 2013 to take his current position as head of special collections and my boss. He serves as editor of the Appalachian Curator and is media review editor for the Journal of Appalachian Studies. We also have our colleague Liz Harper. She is a metadata specialist at NOAA, National Centers for Environmental Information. Her work includes training data stewards on metadata best practices and creating metadata records for satellite instruments. She's a graduate of the University of Michigan School of Information, and she holds a Master of Science in Information with specializations in archives and records management. Previously, she was Associate Professor and Special Digital Collections Librarian at Western Carolina University and Curator of Collections at the Arab American National Museum. It's been said that some people are born a long way from home, and Liz came home to the mountains of Western North Carolina 6.5 years ago, and she hopes to always reside in Appalachia. Jean, you want to take it away?
Thanks, Ashley. That last line from Liz's introduction I was commenting on, and she told me that it came from a conversation with Roger May, and I said, well, that's double creds right there. So thanks everybody for showing up. I'm Jean Hyde. As Ashley said, I'm head of special collections here. And Liz?
Sorry, I had to find the unmute. I'm Liz Harper with NOAA currently.
And start off, we're going to talk about how we came about building this Special Collections Committee of the Appalachian Studies Association. But first we need to do a little background research and study. Last March at the 44th Annual Appalachian Studies Conference in Lexington, Kentucky, the Appalachian Studies Association, then recently formed Special Collections Committee, was scheduled to meet for the first time. Well, that was the plan, but due to COVID, the conference was canceled, and we held our first meeting via Zoom, the Special Collections Committee, on April 17th.
And Jean and I were actually at a restaurant getting breakfast, working on this presentation for the Society of North Carolina Archivists conference when we got the word that it had been canceled. So I think that was the last time either of us have eaten at a restaurant. But issue 4, volume 2, issue 1 of the Appalachian Curator just came out in July. So we are kind of well underway and kind of have some interesting stuff to share about what we've learned so far.
Yeah, and both the formation of this committee and the creation and publication of the Appalachian Curator are the results of archivists who have been working within our professional organization to increase awareness of archives, collections, and archival services. And our presentation today will describe how that all came about. And I'm going to share my screen here. All right, there's a long tradition within Appalachian Studies of librarians, archivists, and scholars recognizing the need for and the importance of archival collections in Appalachian scholarship. For those of you with Appalachian Studies backgrounds who know some of this history, you may know a lot of this already, so please bear with me as we go through this. We're going to go over some of the highlights of the history of archives and special collections in Appalachian Studies. The full story is much, much deeper than this. But like I say, this is going to be covering some of the things that are pertinent to the formation of this committee. All right. We will be going over the historical background here and then talking about what went on to form the Special Collections Committee. And then Liz will go into some detail about how we went about developing and publishing the Appalachian Curator. And our story starts, as a lot of you may know, back in 1966, when West Virginia University librarian Robert F. Munn recognized that much of the nonsense that had been written about Southern Appalachia and lamented that distressingly little in the way of useful primary and secondary material was available for good scholarship. Munn called for the creation of archival collections and supporting bibliographic information throughout Appalachia to help scholars correct this nonsense. In addition to librarians such as Munn being interested in this, scholars were interested as well. In 1976, Cratus Williams, who is often considered the academic force and the father of the creation of what we now call Appalachian Studies, he made this statement at a conference at Mars Hill College. Appalachian colleges should be the depositories of the history of Appalachia. Every college in the region should make provisions for receiving, cataloging, and making available to its students, the people of the immediate region, and researchers from elsewhere, documents, manuscript, diaries, and other evidences of the past history, culture, art, music, literature, religion, and social customs of the region served immediately by the college. For me, researching the history of Appalachian Special Collections, these are the two touchstone statements from an academic scholar and from a librarian about why we need these types of collections. After Cratus Williams' speech in 1976, it was a very busy year in Appalachian studies, and this is just a few of the highlights. We could go on and on and on about this 5-year period, but in 1977, the first Appalachian Studies Conference was held at Berea. And at that conference, a group of archivists and librarians arranged to meet to discuss, quote, the possibility of having librarians, archivists, and bibliographers in the field meet to discuss common interest and problems. 4 archivists met to be a planning committee for what would become the Appalachian Sources of Cooperative Approach Conference that was held at the University of Kentucky in 1978. The planning committee included Ann Campbell from the University of Kentucky, Laurel Norton of Mars Hill College, Jerry Roberts of Berea College, and Eric Olson, who at that time was at Western Carolina University, but would soon move to Appalachian State University. Eric was actually the Appalachian Collection librarian when I was in my master's program there. There, we see from the very first Appalachian Studies Conference, Appalachian archivists were already working together to share interest and information and to help those managing smaller collections learn best practices and archival techniques. The late 1970s also witnessed a growth in archival collections throughout the region, as well as expanded professionalism in existing collections. New collections that were specifically designated as Appalachian collections were formed at UNC Asheville, at the University of Kentucky, and at East Tennessee State University. And established collections at Appalachian State and Berea College had hired professional librarians and archivists to manage their growing collections. And one of the key players in the development of archival outreach and interagency cooperation during this time was the Appalachian Consortium. The consortium was based at Appalachian State University and included members from across the region with a core membership of colleges and agencies in North Carolina and Tennessee. In 1982, the consortium's Heritage and Folklife Committee turned its focus on smaller repositories and collections, many that had been identified in the consortium's 1976 publication, The Bibliography of Appalachia. The consortium established a Regional Collections Committee in 1982 and applied for a National Historic Publications and Records Commission, NHPRC, grant that was awarded that same year. That grant funded a survey of repositories in the region and resulted in the publication of Archives of Appalachia, a directory, in 1985. Through a combination of mailed surveys and follow-up phone calls, the survey identified over 180 repositories, and over half of them had not been listed in printed union catalogs or directories at that time, which in the pre-web world was tantamount to anonymity. The grant that funded the Archives of Appalachia also funded a training workshop for archivists. In addition to collecting the data mentioned above, the survey also asked respondents if they would like additional training in such archival skills as arrangement and description, conservation and preservation, grant writing, microfilming, working with non-paper records such as audio tapes and photographs, managing institutional records, outreach, collection security, and use of computers. So they got a lot of respondents from this. They received 106 requests for training in conservation and preservation and 99 requests for training in arrangement and description. These are things they would use to mold the content of the workshop. There was also interest in grant writing, outreach, and working with non-paper records. Use of computers, however, was not a priority request, probably because many small repositories were unlikely to have funding for a computer in the 1980s, and quite frankly, the use of computers at that time was relatively limited in the archival context. And as a side note here, what was founded as the Southern Highlands Research Center at UNC Asheville in 1977, which is now Special Collections, where Ashley and I work, it doesn't appear in the survey. I've looked for records and can find no mention of us being contacted by the survey at all. The Southern Highlands Research Center was also appealing to the UNC Asheville administration to represent the university at the consortium, at the Appalachian Consortium, but UNC Asheville's administration declined their offer and we never joined the consortium. I mention that for a couple of reasons. One, this may indicate why some of the things that should have been in the survey in 1985 didn't show up. People just didn't receive their mail or answer their phone calls. And it also may indicate why some people who, in hindsight, you think might have been, some organizations who you might have thought would have been members of the consortium were not, such as UNC Asheville. The Archives of Appalachia survey also revealed that a majority of the surveyed collections were administered by a single person, who is often a volunteer or a part-time worker with little or no archival training. In response to this, the Regional Collections Committee founded The Curator, the newsletter of Appalachian Regional Collections, to reach the public librarians, members of local historical societies, etc., who find themselves entrusted with material which they have not been trained to care for. The Curator served as a means of communication for Appalachian collections, large and small, and was first published in 1987 and remained in publication until 2004. It was largely written by professional archivists and collection managers at Appalachian colleges and universities. The Curator featured how-to columns on conservation, handling of photographs and manuscripts, and other topics, as well as a question and answer column, where professionals would provide advice to archivists who lacked professional training. The Curator also included information about archival conferences and workshops, profiles of various Appalachian collections, reports from larger national conferences, and general news relevant to the archival community in Appalachia. Through the Curator, professional archivists provided knowledge, best practices, and other relevant archival information to collection managers throughout Appalachia, in the process building a growing community of Appalachian special collections caretakers. But by the early 2000s, the Appalachian Consortium had shut its doors, and soon the Curator would cease publication. And with the demise of the consortium, there was no coordinated effort or agency between Appalachian collections. So, to build this tradition forward, as Ashley mentioned in the introduction, I became aware of the history of Appalachian archives in 2002, when I was researching my library science thesis at the University of Tennessee. I was researching the history of Appalachian special collections and the relationship to Appalachian Studies curricula. At the time, I was working in an Ozark collection in Arkansas and seriously considered writing my thesis on Ozark collections. I did some exploratory research and traveled to different Ozark collections, but realized that my heart was not in it. I have an MA in Appalachian Studies, and my wife and I, both from North Carolina, greatly missed living in Southern Appalachia. So we did some career changing, and I decided to write about what I loved. She left her tenure track job, and I took a job at Radford University. During my research, I became friends with several Appalachian archivists, including Fred Hay at App State, who I believe is here today, who was on my thesis committee. Norma Riddle at that time was at East Tennessee State University and then went on to Appalachian and is now retired. And Shannon Wilson, who was at Berea College and has since left Berea College and retired as well. We all talked now and then about the need for a special collections committee to pick up the work of the consortium, and we discussed that the logical place for such a committee was the Appalachian Studies Association. Well, by 2008, I had finally become an Appalachian archivist, and I was working at Radford University. And the idea of a special collections committee at ASA was often a topic of conversation when I would meet archivists at conferences, when I'd see Fred and Norman and Shannon. When Mark Brodsky and I were doing some research together, this would come up then. But it was just that. It was talk and it was an idea, and nothing ever really happened with it. But it wouldn't go away. And it's been my experience that an idea like this that won't go away, that seems to have some popularity, is merely waiting for the right conversation with the right person for it to take root and grow. And then one day, in an Appalachian Special Collections reading room, Kathy Newfont walked in. Kathy Newfont is author of Blue Ridge Commons, Environmental Activism and Forest History in Western North Carolina. She was at Mars Hill University and is now at the University of Kentucky. She's a friend of Special Collections and a great friend of archives. And she had helped us procure several collections from a local environmental activist. She knew that they were in his basement, possibly gathering mold, and thought that they would be better if they were in our collection. So I had got to know Kathy. And she was doing some research in one of these collections in our reading room. And during a break, she and I started talking. And we talked about all the sorts of things that two different Appalachian Studies people get together. And I brought up the idea of a special collections committee at ASA. And Kathy immediately said, "You should do it. I'm the incoming president of ASA, and I encourage you to put together a proposal to run by the ASA steering committee." This is kind of what we've been waiting for. So I quickly contacted a dozen other Appalachian archivists. I know several of you are actually on this presentation here today. And everybody said yes. So we put together a proposal and submitted it to the steering committee. And our proposal was that we would update and continue the work of the Appalachian Consortium Special Collections Committee, which is why I spent some time telling you about their work. We would publish a newsletter similar to the Curator, again, while we mentioned the Curator, like we did. We would update the consortium's 1985 survey of Appalachian collections. We would establish a listserv or a blog to share information with smaller repositories. We would promote and raise awareness of Appalachian resources. And we would establish a stronger presence for repositories, collections, archivists, and librarians and their work in Appalachian Studies and ASA. So we presented this, and the only stumbling block that happened to show was there was some hesitation about adding another committee member to the already large steering committee. And I heard this hesitation from a couple of steering committee members, as well as a couple of people in Appalachian Studies who had previously been on the steering committee. So we were kind of concerned about what to do about that, but in stepped Lori Marshall. And Lori, at that time, was the archivist for the Appalachian Studies Association. She's at Marshall University. And she suggested that the proposed Special Collections Committee chair be combined with the existing Appalachian Studies ASA archivist position on the steering committee. She noted, the archivist chair will appreciate this, that's as much of the duties of the archivist essentially now we're transferring electronic records over to Berea College, where the repository for ASA's collections are, that the duties that had been there before were not nearly as big, and it made a lot of sense to combine these two. And so this idea was well received. I went over to Mars Hill during their summer, where they were meeting during the summer to prepare for the ASA conference that was upcoming in 2019, co-sponsored by UNC Asheville and Mars Hill. And I met with the steering committee and made my presentation there. And at the 2019 conference, Asheville, the steering committee proposal was accepted and the steering committee was formed. I have to give a tip of the hat out to Karen Parr, the archivist at Mars Hill and my colleague. She was also on the steering committee at that time, and I'm confident that her presence helped us get this through. So after 17 years of talking about it with other Appalachian archivists, we now have a special collections committee in the Appalachian Studies Association. Now I'm going to stop my screen share and let Liz pitch in for her half.
Okay, let me start my timer. Thank you, Jean. I appreciate the work of Jean and a lot of you in the virtual room today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the nuts and bolts of putting together both the website and the kind of what I'm going to call the print version of the curator. So we kind of got the go-ahead, we're going to create this, but we had to kind of lay the foundation. So there were a lot of things that we had to kind of think about and then decide on. So one of those was the publication frequency, which we decided to be triannually, fall, winter, spring, summer. And a lot of that was kind of reflecting the academic cycle, since that was going to be a lot of our kind of audience and contributors. The scope is Appalachia broadly. Who is everyone, not just those that are kind of, quote unquote, real archivists. We really wanted historical societies, individual collectors, cities, of course, universities. We wanted it to be really broad, people that had any sort of collection. Jean got us an ISN serial number, so we have some kind of authority and legitimacy. And then we also formed an editorial board. So that's Jean and myself, Mark Brodsky, Stuart Pleen, and Dustin Witzman. And we had to kind of put into words who we are and what we're about. So our kind of about is the Appalachian Curator is a newsletter by and about special collections and archives that collect primary and secondary materials related to the Appalachian Mountains. Our intended audience is scholars, students, researchers, archivists, librarians, and anyone else with an interest in research document Appalachia. So what's in a typical issue of the Appalachian Curator? So here is a screenshot of the header of the WordPress site that we use, and you can see kind of those sections. So of course, every issue we have articles, typically 5 to 8. Those can be on any topic, and we encourage all of you and people you know to kind of suggest articles. And sometimes they've been on particular focus areas, such as community archiving. We recently did some about pandemic responses and hope to continue that. There's always a featured collection highlight. So again, those of you that are here that manage collections, we're looking to you. And we also include new acquisitions. So each, triannual, what you've acquired since then. And so Jean always puts out a call to AppleNet, but please be on the lookout for that and send us yours. And they don't have to be processed collections. They don't have to be available online, just kind of generally what is new that you have. So what do we look like? This is something that, I kind of took on a lot of the layout of the, print edition. So, we're more than a newsletter. And then for me, I was raised in the 90s, so I think newsletter, I think a lot of clip art, in a pretty informal structure. And we're not quite a journal. Here we have the original Curator, the AppleLink newsletter, and then Journal of Appalachian Studies. So how do we present ourselves? So a lot of that came down to the visuals. So like I mentioned, we have a blog format / website that's on WordPress hosted by UNC Asheville. And then also kind of what I'm calling the print edition, which mirrors the content. So are we a blog? Are we a publication? Is a blog a publication? And we're both. So on the left is the main page of the Appalachian Curator. You can see that the main page is a feed of things organized by issue, and this one's a little outdated. And then on the right is kind of that same table of contents in the PDF compilation of these individual issues. And a little more comparison on the left is an article, how it appears on the website. And you'll see at the top that it links to a PDF. And so that PDF was really important to us because, the WordPress really just posts things chronologically which can be helpful. Like I said, you can sort by, you know, all the featured collections, but it really doesn't capture kind of the issues, you know, kind of the continuity of the different focus area articles and that sort of thing. So we've got both available up there. So going back to kind of identity, I had to choose a cover image for that. So how do we represent Appalachia? So, you know, I kind of thought about, should we honor something like the long history of crafts or music in the region? I knew that I didn't want anything to do with moonshining. I'm sure we're all a little tired of that trope kind of being trotted out every time Appalachia comes up. So I settled on this photograph. It's from Western Carolina University's collections by Edgar Purdom, who's a kind of a hobby photographer in Macon County. And this is how it translated to the journal. So it's it's scenic, it's evocative of the area, but it also makes for an uncluttered visual. And similarly, kind of had to choose a header image for the website. And this is kind of a challenge because it's a weird shape. So I found a photo by Jim Thompson, who's out of Knoxville, Tennessee, taken of chimney tops probably in the 1930s in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. So you see how I cropped it, kind of edited it, and that's how it looks at the top of the website now. So once we got those settled, I had to come up with how we lay it out. So I use Microsoft Word, and my caveat with that is you have no idea what you're in for, or this software might be free, but you'll pay for it in other ways. So one of the ways, and I'm sure you've all experienced this in Word, especially if you're putting pictures in it, and you move it, literally everything in the document is parkour, which if you're not familiar with that is a method of moving between spaces by jumping and twisting, and Word likes to do all sorts of things. So I often spend a lot of time wrestling with that. So this was something that I created from scratch. I looked at some other journals. You'll see it's kind of a more formal presentation, and you know, that's kind of balancing that newsletter, informal, but also, you know, this is a publication that we want, you know, widely distributed and taken seriously. So kind of the list of things that I had to settle on, and on the right hand is kind of my little template, so I always know what I'm going for. Font size, margins, line spacing, title size, making sure I get my italics, making sure the footer has a current issue, page numbers, which sometimes have to be done manually. When you convert a Word document to PDF, the images jump all over, like I said, making sure there's captions, that's the right font size, that I've got the author information, and then any footnotes associated with the article. So the way I've been doing that has been an evolving process. This is not something I've done before. So the first few issues I did individual Word documents for each article, which I then converted to PDFs, which I then compressed. A lot of that decision was because of the use of footnotes in articles. If I had done it as a single Word document, you know, the footnotes would be at the very bottom. So that was kind of the reason for that. You know, and then kind of transitioning jobs, no longer having access to Adobe products. This most recent issue I did do is one Word document. And then moving forward, just finding a balance between, you know, consistency between issues, but also making it, you know, a simplified and fairly easier process. So I'm not a graphic designer. I don't have a background in that. And so, you know, I used Word. The cover I actually made in PowerPoint, and I can save that as a PDF. And then we use WordPress for the website. So all of these tools, you know, are fairly simple to use. And all that's to say is that, you know, it can be done on a budget without, you know, any particular or specialized skill set. And there's also the little Kleenex logo, because sometimes it's a lot of itty bitty fiddly bits that can get frustrating. So how are we being received? So as of yesterday, the WordPress site has been live 555 days. And you can kind of see this is a chart of daily visitors. And there are a couple spikes, and that is the day that the newest issue kind of goes out on social media and on listservs. And so, you can see that we're trending upward, which is really encouraging. And so that means, we're getting a greater reach, and hopefully people that have looked at it once keep coming back. So overall, in this 555 days, we've had almost 13,000 visits, which kind of, I think, is page views by almost 5,000 visitors. And our best day was this past July, which was the fourth issue that came out, and we had 344 views on just that day alone. So how are people getting to us? So looking at the WordPress statistics, I took the top 10 and consolidated them because sometimes the URL that it comes from is a little different. But after doing that, 49% of our traffic comes from various search engines. Facebook is the next largest refer with 36%. We get 9% from the ASA website and 6% from Twitter. So it's just kind of interesting. So like Jean talked about, one of the goals of the Special Collections Committee was to kind of re-up the Archives in Appalachia survey. So, like he talked about, we're building on the 1985 directory. So at the time, that was almost 1,000 surveys. They were mailed. About 350 responded via, snail mail, and about 360 were contacted via phone. So that survey documents 188 repositories and 195 mountain and foothill communities. And the work to redo this is done by UNC intern Derek Wisnan, who is here.
Liz, a second, talk a little bit about Derek's participation.
Yeah, please.
Derek has been working for us and doing some extraordinary work, and we've actually, he's drank the archival Kool-Aid and now wants to become an archivist. But we had originally planned that eventually we would start working on the Archives of Appalachia, redoing the survey. Well, March 16th, suddenly Derek can no longer come in to work in Special Collections. He had proven himself as extremely innovative and creative and very hardworking. So I thought, well, this is a perfect project for Derek. So he jumped right in it. And, I know Liz will be talking about the methodology here, but I have to say that the work he did has been extraordinary. He's done a lot of thinking to turn the way the data was presented in this original directory. And if you looked at that, it is a clunky mess because they were trying to get a lot of detail into a small print publication with a limited amount of grant funding to do it. I do have to give the caveat that Derek has put together a new formatting on this that we have not got live yet on it, but it's actually going to be quite good and it's going to stand for quite a while as a updated and really nice current survey of Appalachian archives that we can have some flexibility with. Back to you, Liz.
See the thumbs up. Sure, you're not biased, but he's done great work. So continuing on that, this is kind of the methodology of the current survey questions that build on those from 1985. Of course, do you have archival materials that pertain to Southern Appalachia? Asking in particular about web presence or any sort of indexes or finding aids that are available there. Kind of broadly what type of records, what historic, time period, what geographic, and what general subjects, and what size of them. So Derek has finished Georgia, which was the first state done by the original one. It has been a little tough with closures from COVID-19. Again, like Jean said, it's still a lot of small shops that have just, especially starting back in March, were closed up. So work is ongoing with that. And then Kentucky is next. So on the left, that's a screenshot of the original one. So you can see what George was talking about, kind of condensing everything. There were a lot of little two-letter ways to represent the subjects and the types of records. On the right is how it looks currently, with the kind of first draft of the kind of layout of it. So it's pretty utilitarian, which is, you know, great for this, and it's just really easy to browse. So I look forward to seeing, you know, what comes next. And then your help is appreciated. So if it comes out and you're not represented, or, you know, a repository that you're familiar with isn't, you know, please let us know. And it will be continually updated. It's one of the nice things about not being tied to print, is that we can let it grow. So looking forward, we want to continue expanding our readership. As the statistics show, we've had really good success reaching a broader and wider audience. We also want to expand who is writing for us. Like we said, this is open to anyone that has kind of Appalachian related stuff broadly. The Special Collections Committee has talked about, and I believe we're going to this conference, sponsoring sessions. We've also tossed around the idea of doing workshops, which is, you know, maybe not quite so feasible as we continue to do virtual conferences. And then we're also about to start pushing for this kind of Ask an Appalachian Archivist service that we hope to offer. So we've got an Appalachian Curator Gmail address that forwards currently to Jean and I. Others can be added. And we hope that people use that to ask about how to care for collections, you know, anything about digitizing and putting collections online, you know, even a reference question. So we're hoping that this can be a resource. And similar to the original curator that offered some of that practical how-to advice with collections, we're hoping to build on that. So that's what I have. We've got about 15 minutes, so hopefully there's questions, thought conversations. You know, both Jean and I, you know, even though we're kind of doing the project, this belongs to many more people, and so we're open to all sorts of feedback. So.
If anyone has any questions, just feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or you can post them in the chat, either one.
Go ahead.
I'm interested, I noticed that when you were talking about it, you mentioned among some of the examples of materials in the various archives, audio, video, and so on. I'm curious in a general way about what decisions you made about these music archives that have been there for a very long time. Archive of the American Folklore at the Library of Congress, Southern Historical Collection at UNC, the work that has been done since the 20s out of Duke and other places. Did you kind of feel overwhelmed by that and feel that was being covered well enough, or whatever in those archives themselves? Or can you just talk about what your decision process was about that material?
Are you talking about broadly what we're covering in the curator?
Whether you felt like it was necessary to incorporate all the data from those collections, which I know is huge.
Oh, yeah.
The Duke one is the UNC, Southern Historical Collection at UNC, and so on. The Folklore Collection that Dan Patterson worked on as early as the 40s, and other people earlier, and the Duke collection, the Brown collection, those things.
Yeah, one of the conversations Derek and I have been having is, you know, when Derek did Georgia, of course, is much more limited in its Appalachian scope, but now he's doing Kentucky. So you open up a lot of things there, these audio collections at Berea, the oral history collections at the University of Kentucky. So we have been talking about, and Derek's been working on, and chime in anytime, Derek, on how to approach these larger collections. One of the things that we discussed specifically in terms of the University of Kentucky special collections, it's huge, but there are certain parts of it that are more specifically Appalachian. And so we talked about breaking those up as separate entries, like the Combs collection, I believe, of Appalachian stuff, of the Appalachian oral histories that are contained within the Nunn Center's oral history collections. And we do realize that we are going to need to get outside of the geographical area of Appalachia and make sure we include the collections like you mentioned at Duke and at Chapel Hill. So that's definitely part of the thinking about this. And there's also, when we get into things in Tennessee, like the huge number of commercially available recordings in bluegrass that ETSU holds. And Appalachian State, too, has a number of recordings that we need to make sure we're covering those. So the larger repositories do present some challenges on how to be thorough and representative. But one of the beauties, and Derek and I have talked about this, one of the beauties of doing this as an online platform is we can provide some general sort of overviews, but there's links and people can get to the collections. You know, it's going to be impossible to be comprehensive because I think if we all started talking about collections we knew, we'd be here till, gosh, maybe till the pandemic was over. But it's a really good point, David. And we're, as we move into these larger collections in Kentucky, those are some things that we're starting to grapple with. And any input that you or anyone else here has about that, how to make that work, or any things that you see that we should identify, please contact us. Either contact Liz or I or anybody else on the editorial board, or use the Ask an Appalachian Archivist email that we are hoping people will use. But yeah, there's a lot out there, and getting this comprehensive is going to be a challenge, and it's going to be ongoing.
Not mean to imply that I know what the answer to that question is. Nobody does.
Yeah.
And there are a number of perfectly rational and reasonable decisions could be made. I was just curious about kind of how you're feeling about that and proceeding.
Yeah, and it is, entering Kentucky is our first time to start dealing with that. And and Derek's doing a lot of legwork now on digging those things up. Also, one of the things we're doing is I've asked him to search for public libraries that might have Appalachian content that didn't make the first cut, and historical societies which may or may not have been there. I know, Derek, when you were doing like the Forest Service things in Georgia, you found out that they had been completely renamed and totally reformatted, and they were essentially the same collections with totally different storage areas and different identifications and different areas to go find them. So there's been those challenges that he's been working with as well.
Well, and I would just say in the interim between 1985 and 2020, sometimes, like for example with the Forest Service, there's been multiple transitions that have happened under multiple sort of administrative bodies and stuff. So people really aren't sure what was referenced in 1985 and where that might be now. So tracking those changes has definitely been a challenge.
And folks may have been seeing the chat, but I want to kind of bring that. So either Anne or asked, is there a way to subscribe? So we don't currently have kind of a listserv where we send out notifications of new issues or those calls for acquisitions, but that's a really good idea. We've been relying on the AppleNet listserv, which, as you all know, can just be kind of, the volume can be really overwhelming. So that's a great idea. So if anyone has suggestions on how to do that, or you know, that might be a thing within WordPress. We're currently learning and teaching ourselves, but I do think that's great. Yeah, do you have a?
No, I just was wondering, because we are WordPress users, and as y'all may know, David has a blog, and that's a WordPress blog also. There is a way to set up a subscribe in there, so every time there's a new post, the subscribers get notified. And so, Liz, when you were talking about, like, is it a blog, is it a publication or whatever, I didn't know if the aspects of whether it being, if it's a blog, whether we can subscribe. So we just get a ping every time there's something new.
Yeah, I'll definitely look that. I assume it's kind of one of the plugins.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can just put your email address in the subscribe box, and then you reply, you confirm, and you're on it. That's all there is to it.
From the back end, there's a little bit of setup that I can't remember right now, but I could look, Liz, if you want, how we did his and see what we did.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. So thank you.
Well, and we, to be honest, hadn't really thought about that. So the great thing of a forum like this is it's like, that's a really good idea. We should do that. Thank you.
Does anybody else have questions? I'll defer to anyone. Have y'all encountered so far, as no doubt you will, maybe you already have, when we've been doing work for the Park Service, we have come across a couple of instances where there apparently were major house cleanings and dumps of records. There was a big dump at the DeSoto site in Florida. Nobody knows who did it. Nobody knows why they did it. Nobody knows what they did with the stuff. Nobody knows how much there was. But you start looking and there is great holes in it. I just wondered if you've encountered something like that.
That actually, I think every archivist who's listening to this right now and part of this has stories about that. And we probably could run one or two, the lost archives. For instance, with our records from the Grove Park Inn, part of them were significantly damaged, and a private scholar who was working with some of those realized that all of the records of people who stayed there for the first 20 years were trashed because they were in about 8 inches of water, and they were literally picked up with a forklift and thrown into the garbage because they were one compacted mess. And I'm sure everybody here has similar horror stories of the archives that could have been. One of the great stories of that in the American archival community is the military records at St. Louis that were lost in the fire. Millions of military records were lost in the fire there. Does any other archivist want to contribute to this ongoing tale of archival loss woe? Anybody else?
Well, nobody else has questions at the moment. I have another kind of general one, and archivists know this, and I don't. What happens to permissions when materials come into the archive, into the Appalachian archives, and then are treated in the publication and so on? Do they generally become? I imagine there are restrictions on all kinds of records. Those are maintained across that institutional boundary. That's more about how the archives are handled than it is about how they're treated in the Appalachian Curator, but it just strikes me as an interesting question. Derek, I don't know.
Well, of course, every collection that comes in has a deed of gift, and every deed of gift has its own stipulations. What you want, ideally, as an archivist, is for the ideal situation is for the person handing you that stuff owns the copyright to everything and complete outright ownership, and they give it to you. It's yours. Do whatever you want to with it. All that resides with you. And as we all would be able to say grumblingly, grumble, 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 that's not always the case. So there's no blanket statement about how that works. We have collections that copyright, for instance, we have a photo collection from Grove Park Inn that Grove Park owns the copyright to, and we have to get permission from them every single time, and it's now owned by Omni Hotels. So you call the hotel chain to get permission to let someone else use a photo. Yeah, and I know there are those sorts of stipulations. It does vary collection by collection, and that's just the nature of the beast when you take material in. Again, anybody else have anything to chime in with that? There's a whole lot of talented archivists who are here now who have a lot they could say.
I was going to chime in about those lost collections. I've been talking to you a little bit about this, Jean, but last summer, so summer 2019, the staff of the NC room went out to a farm in Swannanoa where all of the records for the Hans Reese Tannery resided in a chicken coop. And it was an 8-hour job between 4 different staff people to go through these things and salvage what we could. And I would say that we probably threw out, just because it was too moldy, too buggy, too something, 6 or 7 big contractor trash bags of stuff. And it was heartbreaking. I mean, it really was terrible, because this was one of those collections that was intact. The person who owned it, his father had been the manager there in the 50s when they closed, and took everything with him out of the building when he left on the final day, packed up everything, including the Jeep. They had a World War II Jeep, and the Jeep is a part of the collection that obviously I can't bring to the library, but it's still really cool, and a light bulb that has never gone out since it was put in in the 30s. So anyway, we're now trying to figure out what we can do with the rest of this material, because it is so full of bugs. And the fire marshal is going to come get me any day now, because it's sitting in my emergency exit. But we would really appreciate connections to deep freezes, because we don't really have access to one, and that's really the only way that we're going to be able to keep the physical material. If we can't find a way to do that, we're going to, I guess, figure out a way to digitize it, and then do that awful thing that no one wants to do, which is throw away the originals. But there are just so many silverfish and moths. When I first opened up the book, it was like out of a cartoon. It was open the book and, moths flying out at your face. But this is awesome what y'all are doing, because you're sort of raising awareness about these types of really amazing collections that are hiding out in certain places. And like, as a public library system, we don't have a ton of cash to do these sort of preservation efforts, but if we were even smaller institution, being able to center that and put it up in the spotlight and say, hey, this is some really important material, but we need your help to be able to do X, Y, or Z with it to make it accessible. I think that's a really great use of the curator, and thanks for doing that.
Hey, Catherine, this is Tim Sims from Appalachian State. We have a blast freezer for our use. If you want to contact me, Dr. Fred Hay, who's on this call, knows better than I how many linear feet will fit in at any given time. Jean has used it, and as far as I know, we haven't taken anything in recently, and well, definitely since the pandemic that required it. But look me up, and we can probably work something out.
Will do. Thank you.
Kim, and thank you for helping Catherine with that. And I have done many carloads of material from Biltmore Industries and Grove Park, and the stuff that did not get thrown out. And unless things have changed, I know exactly how much space that will hold per load, and I can help you with that for up here in Asheville before you take the trip.
Yeah, and I'll just add to the conversation about restrictions. Oftentimes, to get something, you kind of will and deal, and that's not necessarily copyright. It could also be where a donor wants to protect their reputation or their family's reputation or what have you. And so I've not at App necessarily, but at previous places, have worked with donors who wanted their journals restricted until after they were deceased. And the whole point is you don't take stuff in, at least I won't take something in if it can never be made available, because what's the point? And you don't want to use your limited space and your staff time and that sort of thing, supplies. There's a lot of cost associated, as the archivist in the audience can tell you, with taking in a collection and making it available and preserving it and protecting it. And so I'm willing to do that, but I'm not willing to keep anything permanently restricted, because again, there's no point. But, and then like with university records, Duke, I used to work at Duke, and it being private, the Board of Trustees establishes restrictions on the academic records. And I can tell you that's some of the best stuff at Duke. And Duke's got a lot of great stuff, but their institutional records are pretty amazing, and you just can't see them for a while still. But being public, App State, of course, there's not much that is restricted. That's not dictated by state law. So there are also restrictions that we have no control over sometimes as archivists as well. It's just a given based on the institution.
I was just going to add that at least at Virginia Tech, it seems in my experience anyway, fewer and fewer collections are coming in with restrictions on them. I've seen not very many at all in the last 10 or 12 years since I've been there. We have a large number of photographs that belong to Norfolk and Western that we, like what Jean was talking about, have to ask permission from them in order to give the permission to somebody else to use those photographs. But I must say that's the easiest process in the world. I don't have a big corporation. I just have a friendly archivist at Norfolk and Western or a Norfolk Southern Corporation to contact, and she always says yes. As far as institutional records go, it's interesting that administrative records from Virginia Tech are embargoed for 30 years before we get our hands on them. So people who want to take a look at more recent kinds of things are sometimes surprised that, I'm sorry, we don't have them yet. And sometimes it seems like certain shenanigans happen between the time that those records go into records management and we get them, like a collection is diminished in size by a great degree by the time we finally get them. And that's an interesting story that deserves getting looked into.
And like Kim was saying, the difference between working at Duke with their institutional records and working at App, which is a state agency just like us, where there are specific public records laws which dictate how things have access to. I was a university archivist at Radford before, about 15 miles away from Mark, and from state to state, institutional record laws are extremely different. So the access to different things in a Virginia institution is a whole lot different than the access to a public institution in North Carolina. And within Virginia, certain places that are the large land grant, Virginia Tech, they have special rules that did not apply to Radford. So there's, it's definitely not one size box fits all when it comes to institutional records.
I want to make a comment to Mark and then ask a general question. Mark, I've been into those Norfolk and Western records in use and photographs and so on. Yeah. And I always did have to get in touch with somebody, I forget who now, at Norfolk and Western. It was always pro forma. They never objected or anything. But if you're a researcher and you're working on a project and you need to ask about 10 photographs, that can be cumbersome, even if they're cooperative and nice.
Yeah, it just adds a little bit of time to the process, and you probably are aware, but sometimes folks aren't. We used to have about 1,000 cubic feet of material from Norfolk and Western that they took back in 2004, 2006 for their own archives. And it turned out that they were simply on deposit with us, which is something that we wouldn't do now. And they're available through Norfolk and Western, but you'll find references and footnotes to materials being at Virginia Tech from Norfolk and Western that are in fact no longer there. That's not an unusual situation for us. But
now, can I ask my general question? This is a policy question for archivists. One thing I've encountered at Western Carolina, at the North Carolina Room, at Pack Memorial, I can't remember other places. I think there have been some others. Jean, I've never, that I can recall, encountered it at UNCA, thank goodness. But it has to do with the sort of post-dated watermarking of very early and long out of copyright materials, old postcards, things from the 1890s, whatever. I don't know what this comes from, but it is a royal pain to deal with when you're trying to do research. And I have written to Catherine, as you may know, I have raised this question at the North Carolina Room. And there might be various rationales for it. I don't understand what the legal basis for that is, and I also don't understand what the rationale for it is. But it can just I almost never even go to the North Carolina room anymore for photographs because I know I'm going to run into that and I don't want to mess with it. So I try to get UNCA, I try to get, wherever else I can where it's not going to raise that problem. Catherine, I don't mean to be dumping on the North Carolina room. Y'all do
No, but I do want to talk about that. Thank you. I do want to respond to that because I hate it too. It's a pain in the butt. I don't like it. I really want, one of our big things we're working toward now is being as accessible as possible. And my knowledge, the only thing that we have that is under copyright is the Andrea Clark collection. So, that we're about to switch to a real archival system, woohoo, for the first time in our whole lives. And as we do that transition, that watermark is coming off. We're also moving toward fee-free. We plan to do it this year, but because of COVID, the county was like, oh, how about we need that extra, I don't know, it wasn't even $1,000 last year in fees. So yeah, we're moving toward completely open, and if you need something, please let us know, because if it's for the blog, I'm not going to charge you for it, and I'm very liberal about waiving fines and fees for people right now anyway, because we don't own any of this stuff, and that's kind of our philosophy in NC Room is we are the protectors of the papers. We don't own it. It belongs to the community. This is a community archive for the people, by the people, as open as possible. That's our cup of tea here. I don't know what the rationale behind it was originally, David, but yeah, just take them. Let me know. Let me know what you need.
It's such a great collection of stuff, and y'all do such great work, community work and so on. Now, my hat is off to you in every way, but that watermark gripes my posterior, I'm telling you.
When I was at Western, that was one of the things that also drove me crazy. The digitization projects were started about 12 years ago by people who weren't librarians or archivists, so it was a very fear-based one. We also have a lot of materials online for partner organizations, so that water makes a little more sense. The word copyright does not, but we do forward permissions requests. So when I was there, I was brought on the Digital Initiatives Librarian, and one of the first things I did was stop putting the watermark on our materials. But to go back and do all of them was on my list of battles to fight. I believe that all of them should have just a very straightforward Creative Commons license, but it didn't. So I agree, it's so unnecessary. It really precludes people from having access, but that's what it was.
So we are officially over time by about 15 minutes. Does anyone have any final questions for Liz or Jean on this? All right, if not, we will go ahead and end today. And you guys know how to reach Liz and Jean, the Appalachian Archivist email, and they also have emails regularly that most of you folks already know. And we really appreciate you coming today. Jean, Liz, you guys want to say anything? Final words?
Yeah, thank you all for
just
coming. Yeah.
some conversation coming.
All right, we'll see everyone later. Bye-bye.
Bye.